With brisk merry lays, we'll sing to the praise of that honest patriot, the Drapier, who all the world knows confounded our foes with nothing but pen, ink, and paper.
In the early 18th century, Dublin was much more than a colonial outpost of the British Empire. It was the heart of the Irish nation, grappling with the impact of British imperial ambitions. Its bustling streets and vibrant intellectual circles reflected both the influence and impositions of a colonial power.
Ireland is governed by a Protestant elite. Small number of gentry families, nobility, who own most of the land. Catholic land owning is about 14% of the land, the rest is in Protestant hands. And so we get this period starting from 1692 onwards with the advent of regular parliaments, which people often forget about. They don't think there's a parliament in Ireland, but there is. And that's important too, because what we also get is what people refer to as the penal era. So we get the introduction of a body of laws penalising Catholics and Protestant dissenters, Presbyterians and others, being penalised because of their adherence to a faith other than the state church, which is the Church of Ireland. All of these laws are enacted that the vast majority of them don't have anything to do with faith or belief. They're to do with economic and political power, land, voting rights, control, education, all these kind of things.
And it had been clear for some time that things were not going well. Clearly Britain was beginning to the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. I know it's a bit early, but still it's doing well. The war is over after 1713. Peace comes back, bit of prosperity, trade resumes, and Ireland is going nowhere in this same period.
Ireland as a whole is massively diverse. So you've got that big division between town and country. So Dublin is completely different. So from, say, if you're in the west of Ireland. So there are all kinds of divisions of class and of religion, obviously.
So you've a very different Ireland. It's much more clearly divided in the 18th century. There is a Catholic majority, 75, maybe 80% of the population, who have little to no political or economic or social power.
Into this boiling pot of frustration over imposition of British rule comes the writer Jonathan Swift. Swift had previously made his way in the literary and political circles of London, serving as secretary and confidant to influential figures such as Sir William Temple. He had developed powerful relationships, honed his satirical voice, and become involved in many political issues of the time. But it was also an experience that brought with it disillusionment.
He does back the Tories in England in 1710, 1714, all of his writings during that period about English politics. He really does become, along with Daniel Defoe, really becomes a part of that whole English Tory activity, anti-war party, all of that in that period. But they lose out.
He's fallen out of favour. He hoped for a position in England, he hoped for a high-ranking clerical position. He didn't get it, partly because with the death of Queen Anne, he had backed the Tories, and with her death, a new political, elite are coming in, and he wasn't in favour. So he's kind of talks about being exiled to Ireland, very famously, very grumpy.
Comes back to Ireland in what is really an exile, even though he's Irish, he sees it as an exile, and at times he writes horrendously about Ireland, describes it in the worst possible ways. He talks about the shocking climate and all this kind of stuff. But he is disgruntled, he's dissatisfied.
At my first coming, I thought I should have died with discontent and was horribly melancholy while they were installing me. But it began to wear off and change to dullness.
He gets the job in Ireland of St. Patrick's, which, by the way, is not a bad compensation price. £700 a year income, which is a lot of money when you can live on £30 or £40 a year, So he is very rich from then. He hadn't been rich before, but he's quite rich from then.
He's right in the heart of medieval, in old medieval Dublin, where the most cramped living conditions, where the most rampant poverty is, and the people living in the most, this is at the same time as the wealthy are moving to St. Stephen's Green and to Oxmanstown, moving away from this overpopulated and poverty-stricken medieval Dublin, which he is on. St. Patrick's Cathedral is kind of on the edge of that, right by the Liberties and so on.
He would have been seeing poverty and disprivilege every day. He's not living behind some, in some gilded community behind a gate that's in a completely segregated and separate part of Dublin. So he is kind of aware of the injustices and the inequalities and so on as well.
Besides the prodigious profit which England receives by the transmittal thither of 2/3 of the revenues of this whole kingdom, it hath another mighty advantage by making our country a receptacle of persons of second-rate merit in their own country, who, like birds of passage, most of them thrive and fatten here, and fly off when their credit and employments are at an end. So that Ireland may justly say what Luther said of himself, "Poor Ireland maketh many rich."
Swift is a massively contradictory person. It's really, really difficult to pin him down, because you'll find a pamphlet or a letter where he's saying the most derogatory things. So he has a pamphlet, for example, about really making fun of Irish. And he makes fun of Irish brogue and the Irish language.
Filthy cabins, miserable, tattered, half-starved creatures, scarce in human shape, and every male and female, from the farmer inclusive to the day labourer, infallibly a thief and consequently a beggar, which in this island are terms convertible.
And then on the other hand, he could be incredibly generous, and no work on his finances shows that he did actually give generously towards the poor. So he's very elusive.
He writes for a particular moment in time, and he'll say whatever he needs to say to make his point. He's a propagandist and he's a pamphleteer, so you can't always say 100% this is who Swift is, because he'll say something else a week later, and but he's making an argument, he's making a point, and that's the most important thing. And the joy of it is that in reading all of that, it's highly entertaining and funny and so on, but also so satirical and so hard and striking at times.
One of his letters to, I can't remember to who, Ford, I think, in London, he says, "And I'm going off to that godforsaken place, and I am never, ever going to get involved in Irish politics." And he kind of keeps his word for about 5 years, and then he just can't resist it any longer. So Swift enters the fray in 1720. With his pamphlet on the use of Irish manufactures.
I heard the late Bishop of Twomey mention a pleasant observation of somebody's, that Ireland would never be happy till a law were made for burning everything that came from England except their people and their coals. Nor am I, even yet, for lessening the number of those exceptions.
Now, it's full of ironies. One of which is that everybody knew that the quality of Irish goods actually wasn't quite up to the mark, but he's still saying, go out and buy Irish. He, of course, then highlights some of the issues.
I have heard great divines affirm that nothing is so likely to call down a universal judgment from heaven upon a nation as universal oppression.
We can't issue our own coins, we can't control our own trade, lots of our rent goes off to absentees in England, the English send us lots of people for all the good jobs in Ireland. It's a list of about 9 or 10 items, and Swift bangs on this 9 or 10 items for the entire decade of the 1720s.
I would now expostulate a little with our country landlords who, by unmeasurable screwing and racking their tenants all over the kingdom, have already reduced the miserable people to a worse condition than the peasants in France or the vassals in Germany and Poland, so that the whole species of what we call substantial farmers will, in a very few years, be utterly at an end.
You know, savage indignation. And that really comes out in the 1720s. His anger at the way in which he might be unhappy being in Ireland, and at times actually I think he is happy in Ireland, but he's even more angry about the way the rampant poverty that he believes can be dealt with, can be addressed.
What can be more deplorable than to behold wretches starving in the midst of plenty? We are apt to charge the Irish with laziness, because we seldom find them employed. But then we don't consider they have nothing to do.
Swift's anger at injustice would be further fuelled by a new controversy that would fall on the hard-pressed people of Ireland. He would become involved, although not at first, in an issue that would forever cement his name in the story of Ireland.
Part of Ireland's problem was genuinely a shortage of small change.
You know, so if you had a silver coin, it was worth the weight of that coin, and you could trust that. And there was a certain amount of smaller copper coinage that wasn't really of intrinsic value, but you needed that for circulation at the lowest levels of society in terms of buying bread, whatever it might be. So there was always a shortage of coinage in Ireland.
So Ireland needed small change, everybody agreed. So the British government in 1721, I think, so 20 or 21, says, tell you what we'll do. We'll issue £100,800. Why they picked 100,000, that's such an odd sounding number, I have no idea, of copper coins, farthings and halfpence. And we'll issue them for Ireland. And as was done at the time, these things were done by royal patent. So the king issues a patent. Now, patents are effectively a license to print money. And the king being the king, he issued it to one of his mistresses, who then sold it to Wood, an ironmonger from Wolverhampton, reputedly for £10,000, which is a vast fortune in today's money. You need to multiply by 400. So you're talking serious bucks here.
From the get-go, in Ireland, in government circles, there was major opposition to this. They immediately, in summer of 1722, when they hear of this patent, they write to England, write to the English ministry saying, you can't do this. 100,000 is way too much. When we've only got 400,000 per annum in gold and silver, it's going to take way too much out of the economy. It's going to lead to a recession, it's going to lead to hyperinflation, it's going to lead to all these problems. And they're right. They actually are right.
Letter to King from the Irish Privy Council. If the letters patent granted to William Wood should, in all points, be exactly complied with, the loss to be sustained by taking his halfpence and farthings would be much greater than this poor kingdom is able to bear.
In 1720, the British government had passed a thing called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act is a very short act. It says two things. One, British Parliament can overrule the Irish Parliament if and when it feels like it. And two, the Irish House of Lords is not the final place to adjudge Irish cases. In fact, it doesn't adjudge Irish cases at all. All appeals must go to the British House of Lords.
This whole issue of, are Ireland and England sister kingdoms of equal status, or is Ireland really just a colony of England, and despite having its own parliament, its own government, its own law courts, all that, when England decides to overrule anything that happens in Ireland, it can. And this is the constitutional question that Swift, from the Injured Lady in 1706 onwards, has been, engaging with.
Let them, when they once get in, sell the nation for a pin. While they sit a-picking straws, let them rave at making laws. Let them form a grand committee, how to plague and starve the city. Let them stare and storm and frown when they see a clergy gown. Let them, with their gosling quills, scribble senseless heads of bills.
And the Irish political nation, at all levels, including the governments people, say, no, this is a step too far. We're going to stand on principle on this. And they launch a campaign.
So you've got government opposition in 1722, okay. Later in 1722, early 1723, it starts to spread out to local boroughs and corporations because, again, this is about markets, trade, this is a real worry. But where it really galvanises in terms of Irish opposition is when the Irish Parliament meets in late 1723. There's one of those rare occasions where both the House of Commons and the House of Lords agree on an address to the monarch. And it is in opposition to Wood's halfpence, and that's a major step.
The British government keeps saying, they double down, and they say, no, force it through. And they send over Lord Grafton to force it through, and he is a total waste of space. He fails dismally, so they have to recall him. And roughly at the same time, the leaders of the Irish political nation, they go to Swift and say, will you give us a hand here?
I mean, historians are always, I think, very interested in the fact that actually Swift was quite late to the game. So, I mean, much earlier in 1723, there had already been attacks on the Woods halfpence. Swift comes in early in 1724. He's asked, high people in high places are asking Swift to contribute.
And he comes up with this notion. He says, I know how to do this. I'll present myself as Mr. M.B. Drapier. Notice Drapier, not Draper, which is the proper spelling of it, of High Street in Dublin, and how this is going to ruin my trade. So he issues the first letter, which causes consternation.
What I intend now to show to you is, next to your duty to God and the care of your salvation, of the greatest concern to yourselves and your children, your bread and clothing and every common necessity of life entirely depend upon it. Therefore, I do most earnestly exhort you, as men, as Christians, as parents, and as lovers of your country, to read this paper with the utmost attention, or get it read to you by others.
Why does he get involved? Is it jumping on a bandwagon, or is it to do what he actually does do by the time of the fourth Drapier's letter, galvanise that opposition, particularly in Dublin? Now, the opposition to Wood's halfpence is countrywide. The revenue commissioners have told their revenue collectors throughout the country not to accept Wood's halfpence in terms of taxation or anything like that.
Most of you must have heard with what anger our Honourable House of Commons received an account of this Woods patent. There were several fine speeches made upon it, and plain proofs that it was all a wicked cheat from the bottom to the top, and several smart votes were printed, which that same Wood had the assurance to answer likewise in print, and in so confident a way as if he were a better man than our whole Parliament put together.
Amongst Swift's arguments, and the objector's argument, is that the Act, or the patent, never makes the coins legal tender, which is one reason why they can resist without being treasonous in resisting, because they're able to say, this is not legal tender, I don't have to take it.
If a squire has a mind to come to town to buy clothes and wine and spices for himself and family, or perhaps to pass the winter here, he must bring with him 5 or 6 horses laden with sacks, as the farmers bring their corn. And when his lady comes in her coach to our shops, it must be followed by a car laden with Mr. Wood's money.
Well, if Mr. Connolly, William Connolly of Selbridge, who built the Castletown house down the road, he says, he's reputedly earns £14,000 a year. If he was paid in this filth, he'd need 240 pack horses to bring his money to the bank, right? And the bank would have to build 3 new buildings to store it all and so on, right? It's all absurd, of course. So Swift has great fun with that.
Just because a smaller percentage of the population can read doesn't mean that the rest of the population don't hear what's in it. So newspapers are read out to people. These would have been, so Swift's pamphlets would have been read out. They would have been circulated in coffee houses and other places where people would sit around. Those that weren't literate would have it read to them. And so very often, it's one of the reasons why quite often they write in the form of a letter, as Swift does. So, because people understood and would have been used to hearing, even if they couldn't read, hearing a letter read out. So it's a form that people recognise. So you know, as we say, you know, one pamphlet, one newspaper could have many, many readers and many, many more listeners.
In your newsletter of the first instance, there is a paragraph dated from London, July 25th, relating to Wood's halfpence, whereby it is plain what I foretold in my letter to the shopkeepers, etc., that this vile fellow would never be at rest, and that the danger of our ruin approaches nearer, and therefore the kingdom requires new and fresh warning.
So you have the barrier of literacy. Getting a free pamphlet is no good if you can't read the words on the page. So there's an endpoint percolating down the social scale. You're going to reach your endpoint. Then I think that's where the song culture is very interesting, because song culture can reach those parts of the Dublin population.
A spirit divine ran through every line and made all our hearts for to caper. He saved us our goods and dumbfoundered woods. Then long life and health to the Drapier.
A song is easy to remember. It's not long. It's not an 8-page or pamphlet. It's sung by ballad sellers on the street. So a ballad seller standing on the street is going to advertise his or her wares by singing the songs that they're selling, and people pick it up, you know. And the tunes are not new tunes. They're recycling older, popular, familiar tunes with new words. So you mightn't remember all the words of the song, but you're probably definitely to remember the chorus, you know, or the refrain. So I think songs are really important in that way.
We ne'er shall forget his judgment or wit, but life, you must know, is a vapour. In ages to come, we well may presume, they'll monuments raise to the Drapier.
So I do think the songs hint at Swift, and they help circulate that idea that Swift is the author, but they never name him because, of course, later in 1724, there's a warrant for the author.
We, the Lord Lieutenant and Council, do hereby publish and declare that, in order to discover the author of the said seditious pamphlet, we will give the necessary orders for the payment of £300 sterling.
When I've run 300 through that, it'll come up with maybe 10 years' wage of a skilled tradesman. So, you know, it's a substantial sum of money. So it seems incredible that no one turned informer.
2 kingdoms, just as factions led, had set a price upon his head, but not a traitor could be found to sell him for £600.
A group of bankers joined on the 17th of August 1724, agreeing in writing that they should not accept the coin produced under Wood's patent. Other merchants and tradesmen followed. However, this did not stop English Prime Minister Walpole from ordering the Commissioners of Revenue in Ireland to enter the coin into the Irish market, but the Irish Lord Justices did not act. There was no command that the troops be issued with Wood's coin, and the Irish Parliament did not pass any resolution backing up Walpole's order, which effectively prevented the coin from being distributed.
The Lord Lieutenant in Ireland, the Duke of Grafton, who's not very competent at the best of times, just throws up his hands and says, "I can't deal with these madmen and all this." After the address goes over, and he leaves Ireland in 1724, never to come back.
So I think there's almost like a momentum, and that gathers.
One great merit I'm sure we have, which those of English birth can have no pretence to, that our ancestors reduced this kingdom to the obedience of England, for which we have been rewarded with a worse climate, the privilege of being governed by laws to which we do not consent, a ruined trade, a house of peers without jurisdiction, almost an incapacity for all employments, and the dread of Wood's halfpence.
Does Swift care about Ireland? He does care about it, certainly in this regard. He cares about the way it's treated by England in the 1720s in particular, and that's very much a focus of his through a whole lot of his writings.
And we remember the Drapier's letters, but it's important to remember that he wrote 7 and published 5 letters, and those 5 letters are actually part of at least 130. And if we think about a lot of this material, this printed material that doesn't survive, it's probably over 200.
We don't know if Swift wrote it, but he certainly inspired it. Even the beggars of Dublin issue a proclamation saying, please don't embarrass us by giving us this filth, right? Even as begging, it's wonderful stuff, right? You couldn't make it up kind of stuff, right?
Letters from women, defending the campaign as well. Letter from a Grand Mistress of the female Freemasons. Doesn't mean they existed in Dublin in 1724. So you get lots of different characters.
And they were produced very quick. They're cheaply, and we get references to the young boys going around crying them around Dublin, selling them. People buying them and waiting to read. Oh, here's the latest one, and sharing that, a community activity.
If Wood and his confederates were not convinced of our stupidity, they would never have attempted so audacious an enterprise. He now sees a spirit hath been raised against him, and he only watches till it begins to flag. He goes about watching when to devour us.
In Cork, news circulates that a ship is coming into the port that has Wood's halfpence on it. And all the people, as Marmaduke Coggle records in it, he says, all the people in the area all go rush down to the coast, they all get into every boat they can get. And here he's not differentiating between Catholic, Protestant, rich or poor. They all get into every big and little boat they can with the intention of going out to burn the ship before it can get into the port. As Coggle reports, he says, but the more sober-minded people convinced the mob not to burn the ship because it also had tobacco on it, and instead to let them land the tobacco, but to take the coinage back to Bristol, which the captain of the ship agreed to and did. So this, there really is this countrywide opposition. That's down in Cork, and it's quite an interesting incident. You're also getting addresses from all the local corporations to government to be sent to England against the coinage.
And it's now at stalemate time. So Swift goes for the jugular in the 4th letter to the whole people of Ireland.
This impostor and his crew do likewise give out that by refusing to receive his dross for sterling, we dispute the king's prerogative, are grown ripe for rebellion and ready to shake off the dependency of Ireland upon the crown of England, to which reports he hath published a paragraph in another newspaper to let us know that the Lord Lieutenant is ordered to come over immediately to settle his halfpence.
The sound of the Drapier's trumpet, a spirit arose among the people. Persons of all ranks, parties and denominations were convinced that the admission of Wood's copper must prove fatal to the Commonwealth.
Carteret and the new Archbishop of Armagh, Englishman Hugh Boulter, meet with the Privy Council in Dublin, and they look to condemn the 4th Drapier's letter, particularly for what it has said about the king, not being able to write his own, the penner of the king's words. As they say, it's seditious, and so on. So they refer it to the grand jury, the Dublin grand jury, to find against it so they can prosecute the printer, because they ostensibly don't know the author. Now, it is generally known that Swift is the author. So while the grand jury is being convened and so on, Swift then produces often forgotten, a 1-page piece called Seasonable Advice to the Grand Jury. And that really puts the cat amongst the pigeons, because in it, and he really gets into the whole thing of, well, we all know the king can't speak English, so what's the problem? But he tries to, and he successfully, it would seem, to influence the grand jury.
The people in general find no fault in the Drapier's last book, any more than in the 3 former, and therefore when they hear it is condemned by a grand jury of Dublin, they will conclude it is done in favour of Wood's coin. They will think we of this town have changed our minds, and intend to take those halfpence, and therefore that it will be in favour for them to stand out. So that the question comes to this: which will be of the worst consequence? To let pass 1 or 2 expressions, at the worst only unwary, in a book written for the public service, or to leave a free, open passage for Wood's brass to overrun us, by which we shall be undone for ever.
The grand jury refuse to find against it as libelous, and the judge then dismisses the grand jury and impanels another grand jury, which then Swift releases this note from 1680 when it had been found utterly illegal for a judge to do that in England, not in Ireland, but it's the same common law. So he's just ramping it up in late 1724, really ramping it up.
Small world. Carteret's a friend of Swift's. Swift goes into him and says, "How are you, Mr. Carteret or Lord Carteret? I think we need to sort this out. You need to get Harding out of jail, and you need to just... And guess what? Harding gets out of jail, the patent gets cancelled, gets postponed and then cancelled.
And the big worry then is when the Irish Parliament reconvenes later in 1725, the big issue for the government is that they need taxes voted. They need the next 2 years of duties on customs, excise, all of that voted. Most of the money raised in Ireland, over 3/4, is the pay of the army. It's paying the army. 12,000 soldiers in Ireland, and if you don't pay them, you're in big trouble. And they know that if they go into Parliament in 1725 with Wood's halfpence still in existence, that's not going to happen. The patent, Wood surrenders the patent.
The British government do try to have the last laugh. The compensation to Wood for the loss of his patent is $3,000 a year for 6 years, paid for out of the Irish Exchequer under a false name. Talk about fraud, talk about bad bookkeeping and so on.
Not a word is said about that. Because again, in politics, it doesn't matter about that slightly dodgy deal, we've won. And it's a huge victory, the defeat of Wood's halfpence.
The British government now knew that they actually needed the support of the Irish political nation, as I keep calling it, to make things happen. And they actually never invoked the Declaratory Act.
Swift's actions in defending Ireland were deemed heroic among the Irish. He was titled the Hibernian Patriot for his actions. Some residents of Dublin even placed banners and signs in the city to recognise his deeds. He was, it would seem, a celebrity.
I'm always very nervous to say the first, but I do, typical academic, really nervous about saying the first. But I think in terms of, a profile of someone who's not a leading politician or a royal, Swift is a celebrity in Dublin.
Swift was a consummate self-publicist, but never directly. Because don't forget, he's working anonymously all the time, right? He signs nothing in his life, including Gulliver's Travels. He's paid for nothing. But along comes Faulkner in 1725. He's a very young man, he's only in his 20s, and he is a genius of a publicist. And Faulkner gathers together the 4 published Drapier's letters and 2 unpublished ones, which didn't need, the reason they weren't published is they didn't need to be because they'd won the war. And he publishes them in 1725 under a title of The Hibernian Patriot, and it's a bestseller. It makes Swift famous, and he loves it. He absolutely laps it up.
George Faulkner talked about, hung his image up as a sign to his print shop, and actually galvanised students at Trinity to bring up the money, to stump up the money to create a sculpture, a statue of Swift. Now, there's no culture of erecting statues to people other than royals at this time. So Swift doesn't get a statue until it's after his death, so he never lived to see a statue. And then there were 2. There was the bust in Trinity, and then there was the bust in St. Patrick's Cathedral that Faulkner arranged for. Faulkner was crucial in both those actions.
So he basks in that glory. It gets double whammied with Gulliver, only 2 years later. So he has 18 years of just basking in the glory right through the 1730s.
He was reported upon in the newspapers. So his comings and goings get reported in the newspapers, and his birthday gets celebrated. So the birthday celebrations for Swift are things like lighting of bonfires, illuminating windows, so lighting your windows in the evening, publishing birthday verses to Swift in the newspapers. There are a lot of birthday verses to Swift in the years after, from 1725 onwards. So Swift becomes this celebrity in Dublin. There's no doubt about that. And it's the Drapier's letters. So that definitely is strong support for how important these pamphlets were in the public imagination, that he became famous.
Swift's fearless critique of economic exploitation, corrupt governance, and societal indifference has resonated across the centuries. This legacy can be seen in how future policymakers and activists have invoked his ideas, using his timeless observations to lend moral and intellectual weight to their arguments.
The people who follow on from him, be it Henry Grattan, Henry Flood in the 1770s, 1780s, but even post the Act of Union, Daniel O'Connell, Charles Stewart Parnell, Isaac Butt, are all part of the tradition that Swift is a part of. And what we mean there is a tradition of agitating for Irish constitutional rights in whatever model or way you see it. And that's why O'Connell is looking to Swift and others later, because that is the tradition that they are a part of, which is very different to the Republican tradition.
De Valera even who was no really fan, he says, but De Valera admits that, buy everything or burn everything that comes from Britain except their people and their coal. It's a pretty good slogan,
In 1732, his good friend and collaborator John Gay had died. 1735, John Arbuthnot, another friend from his days in London, also died. And in 1738, Swift too began to show signs of illness, perhaps even suffering a stroke in 1742, losing the ability to speak and realising his worst fears of becoming mentally disabled.
And Dubliners loved to tell the story how Swift left all his money to found the House for Fools and Mad, as Swift himself said, the first mental hospital in Ireland, and that he was its first patient. That is not true. That is a Dublin urban myth. He's not mad. He has a stroke in 1742, or more likely several small strokes, and he is declared of unsound mind in August 1742, and he dies in October 1745.
Swift will always be known as a world-renowned writer because of Gulliver's Travels. So why would anyone care about this part of his story today?
So I care, lots of other people care about Swift. In terms of the issues that he's engaging with and addressing, I think it's really important in the 21st century, in terms of understanding even just why we have a system of government that we have. It's where it originates. It originates in the early modern period. It originates out of, I talked about the House of Commons, House of Lords. That's why we have a Dáil, and we have we have the Oireachtas, we have the Dáil, the Senate. They are the modern version of that, and we're very fortunate in actual fact, and we see that even more now in the world, that we live in a democracy and a functioning democracy, and that after 1921, it survived. When you look at other countries post-First World War, their democracies didn't.
It's about craft, and it is about creative energy, that they are enjoyable. It's not reading a dry economic pamphlet. It's not reading a dry political pamphlet. And that's why Swift has stood the test of time. Swift is remembered today, and he was remembered at his own time, I think, because he was a memorable writer.
I was going to give kind of, well, it doesn't matter. No, it does matter. For historians, it tells several stories of local elites, periphery versus the metropole, the galvanizing of public opinion, etc. So there's a whole set of stories where it's a perfect case study. And as a media event, it's one of the first media events in a modern sense. Of course there had been media before. In terms of Irish national identity, it is one of the foundation blocks of the Irish story in the kind of post-Battle of the Boyne world. And so it is important to know and understand it.
Ye men of the Coombe, come lay by your loom, and go to the sign of the Drapier, to Taplin declare you one and all are kind, loving, good friends to his paper. Then join hand in hand, teach other firm stand, all health to the club and the Drapier, who merrily meet and sing in Truck Street, in praise of the well-written paper.
As for his works in verse or prose, I own myself no judge of those. Nor can I tell what critics thought 'em, but this I know, all people bought 'em, and with a moral view designed to cure the vices of mankind. Although ironically grave, he shamed the fool and lashed the knave. To steal a hint was never known, but what he writ was all his own.